Hello, and welcome to Aerospace Corporation's Space Policy Show. I'm your host, Colleen Stover, and this is episode 116, ASATs, Diplomats, and More Than That. So the growing space debris problem threatens all space operations, from national and international security assets all the way to commercial services we use every day. Not causing further debris than the tens of thousands of pieces that we currently track is in the best interest for all of us. So in this episode, we've got Dr. Mick Gleason. He's Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy. And he's talking to the Assistant Secretary of State, Mallory Stewart. She's head of the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at Department of State. They're going to be talking about the diplomatic work that her office does with Department of Defense and international bodies like the United Nations to keep the Earth's orbit operationally safe well into the future. So glad you could join us today. Let's go over to Mick now.
Thanks, Colleen. It's great to be back here on the Space Policy Show, and it's great to have Assistant Secretary of State Mallory Stewart with us today. She has a really interesting job that's really important for, I think, the whole space community out there to get a grip on and have a kind of a handle on what's going on at the State Department regarding space. And so hopefully we'll be able to discuss all that today over the next 30 minutes or so. First, I'd just like to start out by asking Assistant Secretary Stewart how she got started in this diplomacy career path and space and so on and so forth. Assistant Secretary Stewart, how did you get started on this path?
Thank you so much, Mick. It's great to be here as part of this program. So I was the lawyer for the issue space that I now work on for many years. I started at the State Department in 2002 and began developing a real interest in the Arms Control and Verification and Compliance Bureau's issue space. So I ended up being asked to move over to the Bureau as the Deputy Assistant Secretary and really valued that opportunity to move into diplomacy and policy making from the legal side of the house.
Oh, okay. I always find it interesting, different people's career paths. It helps inspire our younger generation to kind of realize that where you start might not be where you end up going later on in your career, depending on what opportunities present themselves. Now you're at the Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau at the State Department. Could you give us a little background on what that means? What is AVC as Arms Control Verification and Compliance Bureau is referred to, and what your role there is, and what the AVC's role is?
Absolutely. AVC works on risk reduction and stability, both strategic stability with respect to preventing escalation and miscommunication and miscalculation between governments with strategic capabilities, but also global stability and trying to raise awareness of what responsible behavior is and prevent behavior that can further destabilize environments or lead to misunderstanding and miscalculation. But we also work from existing bilateral and multilateral treaties that attribute and hold accountable bad actions and try to prevent those bad actions from having greater destabilizing effects.
So thank you for that answer. So, as you know, I was a career military space officer. I actually got to work on your space as in your office as a military assistant. And I have to admit, when I was at the Pentagon before I went to the State Department, I was kind of didn't realize the importance of the role the State Department plays in space security and the roles there. And then once I got to the State Department, after being there for a couple months working on the staff there with many of the people who are on your current staff, the light bulb went on over my head about this is really important stuff. This shapes what the military can do. This informs what the rest of the U.S. national security space enterprise can do, and even our civil space programs. So, could you touch a little bit more on some of the areas that are of most importance, do you think, for helping shape our national security space enterprise and what we can do there?
Absolutely, Mick. And as you discuss it, we realize why we miss you so much back here. So we're glad that you've moved on to wonderful things, but it was great to have you as part of the team here. And I think you're exactly right, is that the AVC Bureau is trying to help define responsible behavior in gray zones, right? Especially in strategically significant gray zones such as outer space, where you can't necessarily see as well what everyone's doing. In our bureau, we hope to figure out help work with our partners and allies to figure out what responsible behavior is in outer space, so that we can better identify and hopefully prevent what irresponsible behavior is. And that works to the advantage of the Department of Defense and all of our spacefaring partners and allies, by helping understand how we continue to contribute to the long-term sustainability and usefulness of outer space, and protect the openness of space for utilization by all countries.
One of the other things I learned there was that it's not just AVC though that has a role. What other parts of the State Department have major roles in space diplomacy, and maybe the Artemis Accords and those kind of things? Because that's not your area, from what I understand.
Absolutely. We work closely with the Oceans and Environmental Science Bureau, OES. It's International Environmental Science Bureau. So under Assistant Secretary Monica Medina, and they really cover the civil and commercial side of space operations and behavioral norms development. And we work on the national security side. Those normative behaviors and responsible actions that assist and are crucial to our national security. But we work closely with OES because both of us have to implement and understand and facilitate the Biden-Harris administration's national security strategy and national space framework to really push forward some of the overarching objectives there as a team. And so OES is one of our closest partners at the State Department, but of course we work with the interagency across the board on both the national security side of space normative work and space operations, but also on the civil and commercial side.
Great, thanks. And I know there's other areas within the State Department that work on specifically other areas of the space enterprise. But OES and AVC were the areas where I interacted the most on a daily basis. And once again, I was surprised when I got there at how much and how active the role is of the State Department. But if we could circle back now to the norms discussion a little bit, because I know that's a major initiative right now, major effort going on there. So could you describe a little more in depth than your initial remarks a minute ago, some of the initiatives that are going on to promote norms of behavior, specifically in the diplomatic arena out there in the world with our allies or in multilateral forums?
Absolutely. I will say that one of the most significant threats that our astronauts and our space assets face right now is the massive amount and the increasing amount of space debris. So in the national security space, this obviously impacts everything that we can do with respect to the use of space and its long-term sustainability. So one of the first things that this administration worked on in the realm of responsible behavior was to roll out our unilateral commitment not to conduct direct-ascent, meaning from Earth to space, anti-satellite testing that creates debris. So destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite testing. This was something that Vice President Harris rolled out in April I think, of 2022. And shortly thereafter, we took this commitment to the international arena as a element of responsible behavior and worked with numerous other countries in both the Conference on Disarmament's open-ended working group on responsible behavior in space, the national security arena, but also moving toward the UN's first committee's sort of context to bring it up as a resolution. And in that forum, we were able to work with, I believe, over 50 co-sponsors to push forward a resolution that committed the countries that signed on not to conduct direct-ascent anti-satellite missile testing that created debris that was destructive. And in the end, we got 155 countries to sign on to this resolution. And really brought out some new partners and new players in this arena to work with us. We continue to push that forward to the UN General Assembly, and we're hoping to build on that initial commitment with additional commitments for responsible behavior that, we rolled out a bunch of them in January, this most recent January, in the open-ended working group again. And we look forward to working with other countries to keep pushing forward to achieve more sort of rules of responsible behavior, more norms development, so that we can avoid the further destabilization and lack of sustainability causing behaviors in outer space. But the reason we're working on this normative approach, of course, and sorry to go on, is just that we've seen other countries try to define terms for the purposes of treaties, where the terms themselves are hard to define, right? In an opaque environment such as space, how do you define a weapon? It's really depends on who you're talking to as to what is weaponized and what is not. And so working on a behavioral approach to what responsible behavior is, as we showed through our direct-ascent destructive ASAT testing moratorium, can essentially establish, regardless of your definition of what a weapon is, we know this behavior is irresponsible and destabilizing, and it's attributable, right? It's also observable, so it helps to get around the challenges we have, especially in the space arena where so much is opaque and the definitions are so hard to agree upon.
So I think that's an excellent point about how verifying capability in space is very difficult. Like, what is it? Because there's so many dual use things, satellites in space, right? So focusing on the behaviors and verifying behaviors changes the problem in a significant way, that then more forward progress can hopefully be made in that arena. However, I do have to admit that there's a lot of skeptics out there for this approach, right? Who think Russia and China and other bad actors will never follow this stuff if they don't think it's in their interests. And so why should the U.S. restrain itself in these when we don't think our potential adversaries will restrain themselves? So how do you answer the skeptics with that question? Because we hear that question all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Mick, and I hear that question a lot as well. I mean, we see several advantages to the approach that we're taking. One, on a very sort of, from a very empirical perspective, we've seen a change in performance, especially with respect to the Chinese government's behavior. In 2007, they created a massive amount of long-lived debris that will continue long after our lifetimes by their 2007 anti-satellite test. With a direct ascent, it created thousands of pieces of debris that will continue for many years. And there was a certain amount of international outcry, including from the US State Department, saying this is destabilizing the space environment. We have to maneuver our satellites. It's threatening to astronauts and space assets for the indefinite future. And it really is unhelpful. And so as a result of numerous sort of concerns and complaints about that kind of destabilizing behavior, we saw the Chinese government change its performance, and several years later conduct the same kind of direct ascent ASAT test, but not creating debris. It was able to be tested against a point in the orbital arena, and they were able to test a capacity, but not destabilizing the space environment. So we saw a change in performance by the Chinese government. But putting that aside, we think the approach in which we demonstrate responsible behavior, and we work with partners and allies to agree and to promote responsible behavior, helps define an arena that has very limited rules and very limited oversight with respect to what is destabilizing or what is potentially escalatory or diminishing of the space sustainability and what is not. And so by defining that arena, we can help shine the light on responsible behavior, hopefully lead other countries to engage in responsible behavior, realizing the creation of debris is not necessary.
Thanks. That helps clarify the reasoning behind these activities and these initiatives the U.S. is leading. And I personally think it's important that the U.S. is leading in this area, because if the U.S. doesn't, then who else would, right? And so it's best to be out front. And you mentioned the 155 countries, but how are our allies and partners contributing to these efforts, and are they following the U.S. lead on this?
Absolutely. I mean, we are working to understand how we can address responsible behavior and really ensure that we are not limiting something that we need to allow. For example, there are certain implications of missile defense technology through, our ASAT, our destructive ASAT testing moratorium. But we're very clear that in the resolution itself on the ASAT testing, we talk about essentially missile technology that takes out orbital satellites, right? That creates debris through impacting objects in space that are in orbit, versus in the missile defense arena, it has a different trajectory. It impacts something in a different way, and we're very clear to try to use terminology that doesn't limit something that's very important for our own national security and those of our partners and allies. But in addition, I should say, when we talk about responsible behavior, the U.S. is often, with our partners and allies, leading in that responsible behavior, because we've already determined it's a national security risk for us to continue to create debris, right? So as I mentioned before, Vice President Harris made this unilateral commitment prior to going to the international community, because we realized it was not in our interest to continue creating debris in this way.
Well, thank you for that for that answer. I do want to touch upon something that is a perception of mine personally, something I in my career, I think, if I can overgeneralize perhaps, but a lot of people may think that the State Department goes out and does stuff without necessarily coordinating with Department of Defense and U.S. Space Force, and they go out in the world and talk with people and come up with some agreements or some initiatives. And then later on, they inform Department of Defense and U.S. Space Force about it and say, here's what we're going to do. You have to follow this now or that now. But could you explain how that really works? Is the State Department out there imposing on Space Force and Department of Defense?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mick, for asking that question, because it is something that we hear as well. And we definitely want to correct that, which is we work very closely with our Department of Defense and Space Force colleagues to understand first what responsible behavior they're already engaging in. The U.S. is often a leader in understanding the creation of debris is further destabilizing for us, but also for the global community. So the behavior that we're pushing forward internationally is often begun in our Department of Defense and Space Force, work priorities, and they help us understand what we're already doing in this important arena. And then we work to sort of push that forward to the multilateral arena to help others understand why the creation of debris is neither necessary nor helpful through these ASAT tests. And so we really start with our defense colleagues and start with our Space Force colleagues to understand what they view as responsible, and to work from there towards pushing it into the responsible behavior of partners and allies around the world. The coordination that we do with them starts sometimes many years before our efforts to take it outside of the U.S. government. And as you'll see, we often have commitments made, as Vice President Harris made the commitment in 2022. We often make the commitments domestically before we go internationally and try to encourage others to make those same commitments. So the close coordination is crucial to everything we do at the State Department, and certainly nothing that we do multilaterally would restrain our own behavior. It's further supporting the responsible behavior that we're already doing domestically.
Yeah, I think I can vouch a little bit for the amount of coordination going on, because as a military advisor in AVC, I felt kind of like I was in the center of the world, because all the coordination, all the emails being passed and forth between Department of Defense and other actors and the Department of State, and I got to see it all and help keep that flow going and that coordination going. And so I appreciate that answer, and helping to clarify the impression out there, I think, is important, that it's a team effort, a U.S. government, whole of government effort, right? And the interagency process is key to that. And it's not like the Department of State is going off and doing stuff that hasn't been agreed upon by the interagency. And so thank you for helping explain that. However, now there's a new factor of a growing importance, I think, and that's the commercial space sector. We've been talking about DoD and State Department, but we haven't really mentioned the commercial space sector too much. And so I guess, as the Department of Defense is starting to have initiatives to integrate more commercial space into their systems and services and space architectures, do you see that as complicating norm development at all, or helping along with norm development and other initiatives the State Department is out there doing?
Absolutely. I think actually a lot of our normative work has been led by the commercial sector and the private civil use sector, because they understand through their operational practices what supports the space atmosphere for future investments, for infrastructure development. They're very attuned to the need to support the long-term sustainability of outer space. So actually, a lot of our normative work that supports our national security objectives starts or even it emerges from the civil space community that is working to understand how we can possibly do space servicing, right, through rendezvous and proximity best practices, to understand how we can signal to other satellites, where beacons are necessary, to understand, what supports both their investment, but their ability to expand on the utilization of space for the future of mankind. And so really hearing from them, understanding what they deem to be responsible, and working with them has been crucial to all the work we do in the normative arena for national security purposes. So they're an important voice at the table, and I know they contribute to many of our delegations, but we also have a lot of communications with them to hear what they hope to achieve going forward and what would be useful to their use of space in a continuing and sustainable manner.
So you just said something that piqued my interest a little bit, and that is how commercial space sometimes contributes to delegations, but we just kind of left it there. Could you dig into that a little bit? Maybe like what delegations are you talking about where commercial space actually has maybe observer status or whatever their status may be in some of these fora?
Yeah, well, it's often with the OES Bureau more than with the ABC Bureau, but for example, in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, in the UN context, it's also called COPUOS. We have permanent civil space representatives that are part of the US delegation to help advise and to support the work that we're doing in that context. We also have civilian and commercial sort of players that are working directly with our Department of Defense, as you know, to help provide guidance and input on what would be useful for civilian operations, but also what would be helpful for the national security arena and what is in the responsible behavior that everyone has come to accept on the civil side that we can move into the national security conversation. And so really having those players both embedded in the Department of Defense conversations in the Pentagon, but also in the international forum on the delegations has been crucial.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So not is it only U.S., whole of government on a lot of these initiatives. Commercial has some representation in these discussions also. I think that's important to understand for the community out there. I guess something else, another question popped into my head as we've been talking, and that is, the Russian and Chinese rhetoric against commercial space, their threatening rhetoric. Has that stimulated any activities at the State Department you can share with us?
I mean, I think, we have to understand where it's coming from, but we also have to point out where it's inconsistent with objectives that they're trying to achieve. For example, we see a lot of the Russian and Chinese delegations pushing forward to this PPWT, this Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Space Treaty. So a legally binding document that would lock in certain prohibitions based on definitions that aren't well accepted, right? So this Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space Treaty would not include direct-ascent ASATs, anti-satellite missiles. It would not include some of the most significant challenges and weapons that we're concerned about, that we know Russia and China have. In fact, sometimes in multilateral forum, Russia has even raised the concern or the potential that they would utilize some of their direct-ascent capabilities against satellites that, for example, were supporting Ukraine. So certainly taking into account a lot of the statements that these countries make that are inconsistent with a treaty, that are inconsistent with the treaty that they themselves support. The idea that there isn't a good or common understanding of what weapons exist in outer space and what weapons need to be prohibited and what a weapon even is something that we point out. And it stems in large part from the statements that we've heard from Russia itself, again, threatening to target satellites that are supporting the efforts to defend Ukraine. So we certainly do listen to their comments. We certainly highlight where it's inconsistent with their support for a legally binding treaty without clear definitions. And we try to also work with them to understand where they can bring their behavior into alignment with what the international community accepts as responsible behavior. We used to have space security dialogues with both countries. We're hoping to return to those to understand sort of where their threat perceptions are and to explain our approaches to the international issue space. Those have not started for many reasons, but it would be valuable to hear from them why they would be opposed to establishing greater responsible behavior across the board, and why they don't support long-term sustainability initiatives such as those norms that we're developing in the open-ended working group and other places.
Oh, thank you. I know that's a question that's on a lot of people's minds, and the concern with their threatening rhetoric against commercial space. And so it's good to hear that the State Department is working on that and pointing out the U.S. concerns to Russia and China with such rhetoric, and with the PPWT going back for several years now. So going back a little bit to looking more to the future, what kind of are the things we should be looking out future? What's next for norms where the U.S. is going to be leading? Is it in the open-ended working group, or in the with regard to the long-term sustainability guidelines? So where can we focus on to see some action or some progress in the coming years or months or weeks?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. We're really excited. In January of this year, at the Open-Ended Working Group in the Conference on Disarmament, we rolled out sort of additional proposals beyond the direct-ascent destructive ASAT testing moratorium that we think can more comprehensively push forward and continue to push forward in the arena of responsible behavior, leading to the sustainability of the space environment. So, those include refraining from any tests or experiments or other activities that result in satellite breakups, or the intentional destruction of spacecraft or orbital stages. Also coordinating with the G7, working to advance this copious working group efforts on long-term sustainability of space activities is something that we're really looking forward to doing, and we're continuing to do. Ensuring the global implementation of 21 consensus guidelines for spaceflight safety and capacity building adopted in 2019. And certainly in consultation with the U.S. private sector, the long-term sustainability working group is also assessing new challenges. So we're trying to look into new ways to sort of work towards sustainability. But this is not in any way an arena in which we're stopping. We're continuing to push forward. We were very happy to achieve the success of 155 countries agreeing with us that not conducting direct-ascent destructive ASAT testing was a responsible thing to do.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. As hopefully our audience has realized, the State Department is up to their eyebrows, so to speak, in space and security space issues out there in the world, and helping to shape and inform what the U.S. is doing. Is there anything that we missed that you'd like to discuss or cover?
I think we've hit a lot of it. There's so much that we can discuss in this arena, though. So I feel like we need many more hours. And it's so good to speak with you about this. But I think it's really just, thanking the spacefaring community and those that follow, what's happening in outer space, the audience of this program, for supporting what we think is just a really good initiative to define responsible behavior and help lead the charge on how we achieve consensus in the international community. There's really no reason not to try to further understand how we can preserve the space environment for others. And so trying to dig in, right? There is a sort of misperception that if you develop norms that you're somehow avoiding legally binding, and that's absolutely incorrect. I think in a perfect world, our set of normative behaviors could be embodied in a legally binding treaty in the future if we can understand common definitions, common terminology, and really come to consensus on the meanings that would be encapsulated in that treaty. But I think realizing that we hope to get there in the future should not prevent us from establishing normative frameworks now and responsible behavior now, and really working with new voices, new actors, and new governments and partners to help sort of come to consensus on how we define what the space environment, what responsible behavior in the space environment should look like. So really looking forward to continuing and hearing from your communities as well as to what we need to keep working on.
Well, that's sounds like you got a lot of things on your plate to work on, and hopefully the audience out there got a hint of some of the things the State Department is doing to help inform them more about how all this fits together out there in the world for our space activities. So thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Stewart. Really appreciate having had you here on the show today, and I'm going to send it back to Colleen now. Okay, Colleen, over to you.
Well, thank you to Mick and Assistant Secretary Stewart. We're certainly honored that she could join the show today to talk about these kinds of partnerships that occur across the U.S. government, as well as out to commercial space and to other spacefaring nations. CSPS has a great body of research on norms of behavior in space and space diplomacy at csps.aerospace.org. Of course, you can browse all of our shows on the YouTube channel we have, or look for the podcast. And James Liggins is our awesome technical director. Thank you for joining us.